Hey everybody, welcome back to the channel. So yeah, I know the feed's been a little bit dead lately. We've been doing a lot of work behind the scenes here. Pretty much been going non-stop, but I'll take a few minutes to catch you up on the progress that's been made. So you can see I got the final covers cleaned up. Bowl gears are cleaned up. Look at the corresponding parts over on this side. See this cover here, a lot better than it used to be. There's the bowl gear. Sprocket shafts are clean. You can see I got the bearings off of the shafts and I have the races out of the covers. So we have those right here. So the bearings didn't look horrible, but we had pressed on them pretty hard, and the one really ate a lot of slag from the welding when I was making that pulling tool on the end of the shaft. So I was able to find some new components. You can see the races I just shrunk out with weld again because there's such a tight fit in those covers, and you don't have much to get a punch behind back here to start driving them out. You pretty much just take corners off of punches. You have just such a little bit of material to purchase on. So it's easier just to shrink those out with some weld. They pretty much fall out on their own, and that's all done. So another thing we did, yeah, that is big, tall, and ugly. But I made a couple behind the scenes videos over on the members channel about, well, basically building this press frame around the 30-ton Ram. So this is something I'd kind of been wanting to do for a while. It's not any of that cheap, flexible China steel over here. This is some old school reclaimed Bethlehem steel. My grandpa got that back before I was even born. But you can see here's some scraps. You could kind of still see the old Bethlehem lettering and some of that. So it's rusty, it's nasty. We did a down and dirty build real quick. Just about everything here I already had on hand except for some of the grade 8 bolts, and well, I even had these two newish looking pieces of angle for the feet down there on hand too, but the rest of that steel is older than me. Yeah, we're 5x5 H-beam. We're not going to be tweaking or flexing that. So that was, well, I chose to just build a heavier duty press frame to take the 30-ton Ram to press those bowl gears back onto the shafts instead of making just a dedicated tool that was a one-use only. You know, these hollow rams aren't the best for a press because they only have like a 2.5-inch piston stroke, but you know, well, we knocked this together. I've been wanting to do it for a while, and I think it's going to be good to accomplish that task. So we have these two finals laid out. This is the perfect time, I thought, to basically show the difference between a narrow gauge D2 and a wide gauge D2. We've got the props set out side by side. Let's get into that. So in the past, I've spoken with a few people that think there's a vast difference between a narrow gauge D2 and a wide gauge. So really, there's not. Of course, the narrow gauge tractors are the 3Js and the 4Us. The wide gauge tractors are the 5Js and 5Us. So you take what we have sitting right here as far as engine and transmission. There's really no way of telling if that's a 3J or a 5J without final drives on it, because all of the stuff, basically engine, powertrain, is the same. They use all the same components for the most part. The only real differences are what I have right here and right here. So here we have beer can components. This is all from the beer can 3J, narrow gauge D2 right here. We have the final housing, we have the sprocket shaft, and we have the upper pinion shaft. Here's an 1113 housing, wide gauge, and corresponding sprocket shaft, upper pinion shaft. So you can see general layout of both of those housings is pretty much the same. You get up here where all the brake components are, the access window, where the lever pivot comes through, all that's the same. We look at how the housing bells in, that's pretty much all the same. But you can tell there's not anything extra on a 3J that doesn't need to be there because, well, we have the compartment where the steering clutch and the brake band and the drum is, which is the same depth on the 5J, pretty much same there and there. But you get outside of that, the 3J housing pretty much just narrows right down and boom, your final drive cover and bowl gear is right there. Whereas the 5J, we have about 5 extra inches of just open space inside there, and then that's where your housing cover and your bowl gear will ride. So yeah, it's they made a pretty efficient use of space with those narrow gauge tractors, let me tell you. There's nothing here that doesn't absolutely need to be. we'll take a look at the cutaway view from the book. And this is a 3J final drive. So we have transmission and steering clutch here. We're familiar with all that. And then here's the drum. And we have a bearing, the upper pinion gear, another bearing. We have the bowl and the sprocket shaft. And you can see there's no excess room in there. Everything is taken up by something. Another look at the backside, you can see from the mounting flange into where the oil fill hole is about the same distance on each one of those. But of course, we are right next to where it bells out to go out to that final cover. Whereas, again, you can see just the extra amount of space they built into the wide gauge tractors. So a few other differences, of course, you look at the lower sprocket shaft. This is the narrow gauge sprocket shaft. You can see it's a lot shorter than the wide gauge. The wide has a lot more material right there. And then the upper pinion shafts is where the real difference is. So you can see this, the 3J pinion, it's just a little short one. So you'd have a bearing here, you have a bearing here, and then boom, there's your clutch drum and just a gear right in between. Set it next to what the wide gauge pinion shaft would be. You can see they have the same bearing on each side of the gear, but then because we have a longer shaft, we have basically a third bearing. So you have the inner and the outer and then a carrier on these. So one other difference, the wide gauge housings have this oil trough that attaches right there and collects oil dripping off the bowl gear and directs it way inside there to that inner bearing. And all the narrow gauge housings did not have that. No provision for that at all because that inner bearing wasn't that far away from the main reservoir. Probably was just decided that they didn't need it. Just putting this 3J pinion back with the rest of the parts. This came out of the beer can. What can I say? This is exactly how I pulled it out of there with the piece of the bearing race missing and everything. You can see how those rollers had really cut in, and this final was, it was missing so many pieces of teeth. It was just chewing metal around and around, and it was destroying itself. This is the only reason I've hung onto this piece was to try and, use it for a comparison like this. I think it's going to scrap pile next, but yeah, that's why when I took the finals apart in 1113, I mentioned you get into these, they're usually either good or they're not. There's really no mid-ground in between. But yeah, here's your main difference here and here between a narrow D2 and a wide, other than your pivot shaft that both the track frames mount on. Of course, on a wider gauge machine, that shaft is going to be wider. And also the large leaf spring that goes beneath the engine right ahead of the bell housing. Narrow gauge tractor, it's going to be a lot shorter than a wide gauge. So, but otherwise, it's the same clutches, it's the same gears, it's the same covers. They actually did a pretty good job about being rather modular with that, where it's the same tractor, just minus 5 or 6 key components. So performance wise, of course, wider tractors are better on side slopes, things like that. But from talking with people that actually farmed with these, various topics that have come up on forums over the years, blah blah blah, I've heard the same thing, and that is that narrow gauge D2s could actually slightly outpull in a straight line pull the wide gauge tractors. And I guess it stands to reason because the longer your powertrain, the more you have to go through before you finally get the power into the ground, the more power you're going to lose. So, longer shafts, more distance. And we're talking like maybe of a factor of 200 to 300 pounds drawbar pull. So negligible when you consider a first gear pulls over 6,000 on a D2. So, but they said also, like if you were in a turn, like light disking, tillage, things like that, and you were pulling an arc, that's where a wide gauge tractor would actually outpull a narrow gauge because you'd have more, leverage on the turn. Your tracks are out a little bit further. It would make it just a little bit easier to turn. But, my opinion, take it for what it's worth. I can't back it up with any science. But my opinion is you probably have an optimum drawbar pulling D2 in a narrow gauge configuration, like with a 12-inch wide track pad. Because for the weight of the machine, if you had a 12-inch wide track pad with good, sharp, tall grousers on, you pretty much are able to plant those all the way into the ground. On average, I'm saying. Not under all conditions. But you can get the maximum amount of traction for the amount of power you have in, a machine that is about the weight of a D2, I'd say, with a narrow gauge and a 12-inch wide pad. When you get into the wider gauge tractors, the wider pads, you're not going to get those grousers as far into the soil on average because, you know, you have that flotation factor. You're riding a little bit higher. So it stands to reason how, yeah, narrow gauge D2 is probably going to be a better drawbar tractor performance-wise than a wide gauge, but marginal. It all depends on your operating conditions. If you're doing a lot of side slopes, you're going to want a wider footprint. Plus, putting big old swamper pads on wide gauge tractors just looks so cool, right? All right, one last bit of information to wade through before we can finally start putting something together. So, sprocket shafts, first generation, second generation, laid out side by side. So, here's 1113's shaft that has the straight, tapered, and keyed surface for the bowl gear. And then here is the later generation that is just the tapered and splined bowl gear area. So, they take different bearings because this surface is a different size from this surface. So on these early first generation shafts, this is a 2 3/4 inch bearing flange. Takes the Timken 566 bearing. The later version, this is 2 7/8 around here because the splines added extra material and extra bulk up there where the bearing goes. So that takes the Timken 567. Outside diameters of both these bearings are the same because they take the same 563 race between the two. So I got 2 new 563 races right here. These are 2 new old stock Timken 566s. Let's get those opened up, have a look at them. Yep, looking good. All right. The bearings, I believe, are a military surplus. They've got all those numbers on there. Clean and lubricate prior to use or as required. We'll see. Should already be clean, right? So, yeah, we have the kind of aluminum wrapping. Again, with all the same military numbers on there. Okay, and they're sealed up in another bag, which is all right. It's good and oily, I like that. 566, yep. Nice, perfect. All right, good set. One race in. This press is awesome. Okay, so we repeated the same process for the race on the other cover. Didn't think you guys needed to see that too. So now we're pressing the first new bearing onto the shaft. Got it supported on the bottom so that the roller cage is free. Okay, so there we've got both bearings on both sprocket shafts. We've got both races and both covers. So at this point we can, well, finish loading the covers, get those bearings put in these upper bores here. But before we get into that, we need to stop and think about something. So what I'm planning on doing here, and we'll take the bowl gear from the right side, get it up on the bench where we can see it. So we have, get it spun around here. All right, so you can see we're starting to get some of that drive side tooth face wear going on because 1113 spent a lot of time in forward gear. But the reverse sides of these teeth are like new. You can see all the hobbing marks left from the machining process when they cut the gear back there. So what we're going to do, we're going to swap bowl gears side to side. we're also going to swap these pinions side to side as well. So all of those old pinion bearings are going to follow those same pinions. So when we start loading the bearings in the covers, we're going to take the bearing from the left cover, put in the right cover, and then vice versa. I'm also going to swap both of the sprocket shafts left to right. That keeps this press fit taper surface the same, shafts to gears and all. So that's actually, well, a fairly common practice that they used to do back in the day, because keeping 1113 as a drawbar tractor, it's really only going to have, you know, powertrain forces in forward gear. Reverse is really not going to have to cope with anything. So putting these worn teeth on the reverse side of things is going to allow me to run these gears the rest of the way out, like we'd ever put enough hours on this thing at this point to wear those the rest of the way out anyway. Plus, it allows me to keep these first generation non-splined tapered gears and sprocket shafts and everything, and keep this pretty much as it was in the original configuration. So there, we've just completed the shuffle. So take the cover here. Now that's on the bench. So we have this outer pinion bearing right here. So you can see this side, the race is kind of closed off. This side looks like it's kind of like a snap ring. You want to put this side out. That's kind of more of a thrust face. Just tap those in. Flush is all you need to do right there. We can pop the gasket on. And install the 4-bolt cover. All right, bearing's all loaded in the right side cover. We've already got the bearing put into the left side cover. So shafts and bowl gears are next. Okay, we've got oil on the bearing and the key is in place. And as usual, tapers clean and dry. Place the cover on. Good spin. And now we'll put the gear on. So what I'm doing right now is just running the nut down. We don't have a lock under here yet because, you know, we're not ready to even have the nut on, but I'm just going to cinch the nut, which is going to stick the bowl gear onto the taper just enough so that I can take the nut back off, flip this upside down, and get it in that big ugly press over there to actually press the gear onto the shaft. So this is just something that's going to help this to hold itself together better, so that I can get it all positioned where I need it to be. Okay. So here's our setup, and the reason why this video took like a week worth of background work to make. So yeah, big ugly press frame here. So we have the 30-ton hollow ram up here, and there's a piece of threaded rod in here that engages with the piston on the end, and I put one of those 1 1/4 by 7 standard nuts that I got when I was making the coupling for pulling on there. That's going to be my push point. So we're supported on the table underneath the hub of the gear, and all we're going to do is press that sprocket shaft right down into it. We'll watch the gauge right here, 30-ton scale. Now, book spec for these is 25 tons press fit. These released for me from 22 to 25, and we have some old metal. I mean, these parts are old, so I'm gonna go, I think, to 20 tons on this and call that good. A D3400 is not going to loosen up a 20-ton press fit on a bull gear, so 20 on the scale is what we're looking for. 5, 10. 15. 20 tons, calling it good. So the big ugly press proved itself to 20. We'll assess here real quick. So with it sitting like this, the cover is seated on the bearing. First thing we want to do is spin, make sure we don't have any contact. No scraping, so that's good. Second thing we look at is how our gear pressed onto the shaft. So you can see the key down in there. I aligned the key with the top of the taper on the shaft. And looking at this here, it looks like the hub on our gear is not quite 1/8 of an inch above the top of the taper on the shaft. So that indicates a good fit. Once again, if you press something on and the hub is below the top of the taper, that means you have worn components, either gear or shaft or possibly both. So we have a good fit up right here. Let's perform all the same steps for the left side. Tons. 10. 15. 20. Watch that rebound when the pressure comes off. Bet it moves a 1/4 inch. All right, so with both of the bowls pressed on, we can finally make all this stuff permanent. So we've got the gear locked to the cover with our special tool once again, so we can cinch that nut down. Now, here's the old fold over lock. It's the style that has the tab in there. And honestly, this has only been used once, so it would be perfectly acceptable to hammer this flat again. And as long as the tang is in good shape, put that back on, tighten the nut down, and then just bend it in some other location, and it would be just fine to go again. But I had some flat sheet steel on hand, so I just made a couple of my own new ones. Pretty simple. I just replicated the outside diameter, inside diameter, and then took a Dremel with a very thin cutoff wheel, cut a couple of slits, and bent the tab in there. So we got some new fold over locks. Didn't even check the number. They were just real quick to pop out, so that's what we did. So line the tab with the key slot, and we'll just tighten the nut. Click. Okay, so fold over lock is done, both sides, and I decided to do the double fold on this. So not only do we have the tab that's down in the keyway slot, I did a downward fold here just on the counterclockwise side of the key slot abutment, and then we folded up over here just to give that a little bit of extra grip on each one. We've got the bowl gears and the shafts and the bearings swapped side to side, so we are on the fresh faces of the teeth on the gears. And yeah, I'll tell you what, all it took was to build a special tool about the same size as a D2 to get it done, right? So that's all right. That's why I call this the bullfight, because for me, these have always been the most difficult pieces to work with on a Cat D2. Lots of work, lots of tools, lots of pressure to get them apart, and the same thing going back together. But I'm pretty happy with how all that stuff turned out. And like I said, we've got another tool in the arsenal. I'm probably going to take the ram off this, and we're going to store this outside just because it's so darn big. But like I said, we fought the fight. I think we did well, and we came out the other side. This was probably, there was probably more behind the scenes work to get this video put up than any I've done on the D2 so far. I know the feed's been dead for probably a little over a week now, but I tell you what, behind the scenes, we were just going, just every spare minute we had, we were getting something done. So happy with the big press frame, happy with that job. I think when we start back again, I think it's time to fit those oil troughs in here, and we will do a dry run assembly of just the cover, bowl gear, and shaft onto the final housing to check that clearance in there before we get anything else in the way. So we definitely have this one that has to be remedied. So hopefully all that's going to go fairly well and not give us much for problems. So that's going to wrap it for today, folks. That's all we have time to do in the shop today. As always, thanks for watching. Hope to get that next video out a little bit quicker next time, and just hope to see you all back again for that.